Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode 6 of The Scheme of Things. This is Zaki Khalid.
And this is Talab Rahim.
Talha, it's good to see you after not a long while. And that's because, as you are aware and the audience doesn't know, I had a fantastic 1 week of much needed excursion to the northern areas. I was fortunate enough with my family to visit Chilas, Hunza, and these beautiful places in Gilgit Baltistan. So, for anyone who is wondering now, obviously, due to the third wave, it's not recommended, and I wouldn't personally recommend that this is the time to go. But when things ease down and there are proper facilities in place, then this is a must visit place. It is a beautiful place to visit and one of the hidden beauties of Pakistan, and I was really very fortunate to visit it. I had a fantastic time over there, and some of my tweets have also shown that I experienced some extraordinary incidents over there. There are cherry trees and snow-capped mountains, peaks, and a fabulous history of the people of the area. The people of Hunza and Gilgit Baltistan are a very harmonious and tolerant and peace-loving people, very courteous, and I'm really looking forward to go there again, inshallah. And so, what has been going on at your end, Talha?
Okay, so what has been going on at my end? I just recently procured this book, The Adventures of Amir Hamza,
Oh
popularly
my
known
God!
as Dastane Amir Hamza, translated
Is that the
by,
Umro Yar thing?
yes, Imro Yar thing. In fact, I was surprised. Actually, I thought that Musharraf Ali Farooqi Saab, the translator of this book, uh, uh, worked on it. I was thinking, I thought that this got published perhaps a year or two back, but after going through the prologue, I realized that this book got published in 2012. So Farooqi Saab has done a wonderful job, and I feel so unfortunate. In fact, this book got published in 2007. That is the date that has been given uh, beneath the introduction that was written by Farooqi Saab. So I'm so I'm so unfortunate that I got to read this after such a long time, and this was on my reading list since the last perhaps since the last 15 years or so. And uh, Farooqui Saab spent some. I was reading the introduction. He could spend some around 7, 8 good years translating this work that was originally done by Ghalib Laknavi and Abdullah Bilgrami back in the 19th century.
Indeed.
So very good book, and the job that has been done on translation, tremendously done. I think perhaps it couldn't have
You have
been
to
any
tell me
better.
how the English is because I've heard it's very impeccable and very.
Yes.
And just to let you know, okay, how do I know of this? I have some familiarity with Amir Dastane Amir Hamza. I think it was 2013 or 14 in Lahore, and I used to work someplace else, and my boss, she forced me to attend this Dastan by some narrators from India. I think they were relatives. I was told that they are relatives of Musharraf Ali Farooqi Saab, and they were these two gentlemen from India, and they came and they sat down and they recited the Dastan of Amir Hamza and Umro Ayar's tales. It was a fabulous experience, but you have to tell me how it is in English because I'm just wondering if the charm will still be there.
I think Farooqi Saab has managed to retain that charm that was, if I recall I recall reading Amro Yar like around 20 years back. So at that time, the bewilderment and the fascination that used to uh, come with the reading of the text at that time. I think scarcely. I have read around 100 pages of this book in the last three
Mm-hmm.
four days, and
Wow.
it makes up for a very light reading. Uh, the text is easier to read, and I can understand how onerous it would have been for Farooqi Saab to keep the like he had to balance it out. He could have made it. He could have simplified the text to the level that the text would have lost its charm.
So he has
But
preserved the essence, basically.
yes, preserve the essence. Yes.
Interesting.
So let's get on to
You
the
have to
King of
share
Kings.
your feedback. You have to share your feedback with me once you're done. Maybe I'll borrow yours. So let's move to
Most
our first topic, Tala. And what would you like to speak on first today?
okay. So I would like to comment on the meeting that is ongoing between U.S. Secretary Defense and the Defense Minister of India that happened today. His high-profile visit
Okay.
to India. So I won't be commenting on the meetup that Austin had with Doval and Prime Minister Modi. I'm more interested in what transpired between Rajnath and Lloyd. So there are four takeaways uh, of this meeting. Most importantly, most significantly, I found this statement of Rajnath Singh very significant when the joint statement that was issued once the meeting concluded. Rajnath Singh talked about enhanced Indian cooperation with Pacific Command, Central Command, and African Command. And something that you have been talking about in the segments that we have done in the past. You have talked about how the U.S. CENTCOM is ramping up its effort in this region. This was one important takeaway. Uh,
Interesting.
Rajnath Singh talked about bilateral and multilateral exercises, not only with Indo-Pacific Command, U.S. Pacific Command, but also Central Command and the African Command.
Very interesting.
Um, and they have also talked about the operationalization of foundational agreements, the CONCASA, LEMOA, and BECA. So some conversation has happened on the foundational agreements. There have been talks about collaboration in defense industries.
Just a heads up for the audience who may be unaware, Samran Ali of the Center for International Strategy, CISS, he wrote a very detailed paper on the foundational agreements between US and India for CSER. You can check it out on the website. So indeed, I think they keep on reaffirming those agreements, and recently they also signed that maritime technical information sharing, which is basically a very fancy word for maritime intelligence and naval intelligence. So just goes to show you, I mean, okay, CENTCOM still makes some sense, but AFRICOM, so obviously you can see that there is a convergence of interests in Africa. Strange.
So the think about it, the AOR has expanded all the way from Florida to okay. So all the way from Florida, I'm forgetting the port. I'm forgetting the port. Uh, all the way to the African continent. So think about the AOR, the breadth and expanse of the vast expanse of the
Exactly. I mean, it's unusual that one country, because it's the US that decides what sort of overlapping relationships it wants with countries that fall in different AORs. But this is unusual that it's the other way around, that one country which is in one specific AOR, it wants to expand its relationship with the US in multiple combatant commands. That's quite unusual.
Absolutely.
You won't
That's
hear Japan. I mean, fine, there is some basic cooperation, but three different combatant commands.
Yes, and I don't know. Perhaps you can. Uh, it's more. You have done more research on this, but I don't think that Australia has shown similar has shown similar aspirations when it comes to
Eh,
engaging with.
Absolutely not. Australia does not have that sort of interest in the Western Indian Ocean.
Yes. So in India is the only country out of this India and the United States out of these coalition of four who want to expand the partnership uh, in these different different theaters. So and the fourth key takeaway was joint capacity building in the Indo-Pacific. So these were like the key takeaways, and I thought that the enhanced Indian cooperation with PACOM, CENTCOM, and AFRICOM, this point merits some discussion at our end. So, what the next? There are some certain three other pointers that I want to discuss that I think we need to focus on. We have to talk about the sanctions, the CARSA sanctions. Uh, I have been looking at the statements that are coming out of India. Uh, I haven't been unable to find any such uh, any such reports, any such media reports in which it has been mentioned that CARSA, the issue of CARSA has been raised with the Indian counterparts by Lloyd Austin.
Indeed.
So again, this is very strange. You have I recently shared two pieces on my wall. One written by Temur Fat Khan of ISSI. He talked about the S-400 and
Missile
how
defense system.
yes, S-400 missile defense system, and how whether it would when he mentioned about S-400 systems, he talked about how Turkey did a $2.5 billion deal with Russia, and CARSA was applied on it, but India, despite having having dealt with Russia on the S-400 system, and even the deal amounts to 5 billion, twice the amount of what was done by Turkey.
Indeed.
US has been, there is this certain reluctance that you can see at the part of the US administration uh, to levy the sanctions that it has been applying elsewhere. So
Indeed.
so
Do you
this
know the
is
meaning of the slang term which you use? What is the meaning of to suck up to someone? I mean, what you have this country in South Asia, it wants to purchase these systems against America's own strategic adversary, which is Russia. And then earlier during the Obama era, I think India was given special exemption to purchase oil from Iran despite the sanctions. So
exactly.
this uh, great power in the world, it's so hell bent on trying to appease India, and that just goes to show you that keeping all that rhetorical bullshit aside, it's at the end it's all about trying to posit India as a regional pivot for manage as a regional watchdog.
Absolutely. So when you talk about the credibility of United States as a leading power in the international system, the credibility has gone down the drain. You cannot. You are like I talked about Taimur Fat Khan. There was another article I shared of Samran Ali of CISS, again written for the CSCR website. So Samran has talked about how the punchline of that article was that North Korea's ICBMs are as bad as India's. So US has been supporting India um in augmenting its missile capability. So India has been with the assistance, with the support, with the direct support of US, and we call it direct. I'm calling it direct support because in US has done these foundational agreements with India, Bika, and all other things. You got so so. US has been ramping up India's missile capability. So North Korea's ICBMs are as bad as India's. So the credit
Absolutely.
US as one of the leading powers of the international system, where is that credibility? So and we are talking about CARSA. So you see the articles that are being written by people sitting in Washington, Baldwin analyst, and people sitting in Delhi, the analysts sitting in Delhi. They've all been trying to somehow. I can sense that there was this blackmailing aspect that was being incorporated in the discourse that has recently come out. So there is this common strand of argument that goes like, okay, so the partnership will be threatened. The partnership will be threatened if US applies CARSA on India. So this is like going on again and again and again, and somehow this signaling is being done
I think
that
some people like our inimitable Mr. Brahma Chilani sending a very fierce message that if you impose cards and all, then ultimately the discreet message which they try to give is that then how will you be able to contain China? And but publicly they have to deny that that's what's going on.
exactly. See, you see the analysis that has been written by Abhijit ER Mitra on News 18.
Yes.
Read that analysis. So he has like gone on this harangue. Okay, so the Trump was better, but the Republicans were better because they used to talk on the tangibles, but the Democrats are fixated. They have like the ideological worldview of the Democrats is inflexible. So somehow, and then he somehow related it to the levying of sanctions, CARSA sanctions. So they are like trying to give this impression. Okay, don't make it a card. Don't make CARSA a talking point in this visit of Lloyd Austin. So there shouldn't be any conversation regarding CARSA. Talk about other things. Don't bring CARSA in between. So that is one thing. Another most important thing, you have this letter that I shared with you.
Indeed. Senator, I think Robert Menendez or I
Robert
believe.
Menendez raised in House Foreign Affairs Committee about India's human rights credentials and erosion of democracy.
Poor
So
credentials. Very strong wording used in it.
very strong wording used. So
And despite the fact that that language was nowhere to be seen, even a brief, indirect suggestion to word it in the joint communique issued by both Washington and New Delhi, you don't find any of that acknowledgement at all. I mean, obviously, if it was the case of Pakistan, that would have made in the opening sentence.
absolutely, absolutely. Although there have been some news reports, one published by NTTV, they said that Lloyd Austin talked about and had this discussion done in private, but there was no public acknowledgement of this. Uh,
You
so
see, it
this,
all goes down to Mr. Jaishankar, and I think in a few previous episodes of the scheme of things, I mentioned that. In fact, in one of my papers, I mentioned that how he is actually the guy who is, you can consider him alongside Shinzo Abe to be the brains behind the whole Indo-Pacific concept, that whole terminology and phenomenon. Because when he was posted to Tokyo 96 onward, then Washington and all that, he was the guy who was responsible for bringing the Japanese vision into Washington from into Obama era and then into the Trump era. And now he's the guy who's the linchpin of all of this. So when he's over there, you can't expect the Godfather over there to have any sort of tolerance. I mean, just consider the fact that this is going to be a bit off topic, but you remember Mr. Jaishankar's recent remark as a full-blown bhakt, in which he said that we don't want any outsiders to tell us what's wrong with our country. So obviously, you don't want Lloyd Austin or the Pentagon to tell India that their human rights record is not satisfactory. And obviously, that didn't mention Kashmir. That's interesting because if it was Kashmir, you could say, okay, well, they have some political considerations. It was a general human rights abuse record, but still, I mean, the facts speak for
Absolutely.
themselves.
The facts speak for themselves. And in fact, we should dedicate some other episode of this King of Kings to the Indo-Pacific. I would want to discuss this amazing article that has been written by Van Jackson, Foreign Affairs, on the idea of Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific construct. So we should dissect it. We should dedicate a session for that. So the last and the most important point of this Lloyd Austin
Topic.
topic. Yes. So the last and most important point is one of the talking points of Austin that talked about the US-India major defense partnership and advancing cooperation between our countries for free, prosperous, and open Indo-Pacific and Western Indian Ocean region.
Oh, interesting.
So we have been seeing the Biden administration mantra of partnership for Indo-Pacific region and quote unquote beyond. So this beyond thing is not to be taken lightly. And in fact, I'm trying to recall. In fact, Lara Seligman wrote this article.
Yes, Politico.
For the Politico, and she mentioned that there is this concern under the domain. She talked about the concern regarding Chinese economic investment across the region, including building a strategic port in Gwadar. So Gwadar has propped up as a talking point between the Indian and between the Indian and United States officials. So this is something that should be of major concern to us. And I am trying to understand why the United States is construing Gwadar as a strategic port. So this is something that perhaps we should some other time we should have a discussion on it.
I think one of my earliest perspective papers for CSCR titled Indo-US Militarization of Western Indian Ocean. I covered this aspect that it basically started with that whole National Defense Authorization Act of 2020, in
Absolutely.
which the Congress they tried to they actually approved expanding the scope of Western Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean. So they actually the whole Indo-Pacific concept it touched the shores of California basically. So when you look in terms of that, the nomenclature change, and then it's surprising, Talha, that these are some of the things which I don't understand because politics, especially U.S. politics, is not my forte. But just commenting as a layman on this particular aspect, that surprising continuity in policy from the Trump regime and to the Democrats and Biden. I mean, you just really wonder who are the people behind the shadows who are so potent enough to keep those policies going. And
Absolutely.
actually, you see day by day those things. Now it's just like whether it is Trump, it is Obama, it is Biden, it doesn't matter. The fact that the trajectory of Indo-US relations, strategic relations in India's so-called backyard keeps on escalating and improving day by day, that just raises more alarm bells.
Yes, definitely. So this was one thing, and you rightly pointed out this National Defense Authorization Act, NDA, that was signed during the Trump administration, if I can.
Indeed, and that was centered around Western Indian Ocean. They specifically
Yes, that was
focused on that
centered around
portion.
the Indian Ocean, but you see that the Biden administration has been more vocal about it, and they have gone to like this. If I can recall, there was this statement that came out at some time during the end of Trump administration, some statement that was made, Indo-Pacific and beyond. But if I can recall, in the last 2 3 months, I have seen it coming again and again since Biden has been sworn in as U.S. president. So we have seen this and beyond and beyond and beyond coming and coming. So this is something very important. So now this my side of the first topic has concluded. Zaki, what about you?
Well, since we're talking on the so-called Indo-Pacific, so keeping that quote-unquote nomenclature into perspective, I've chosen one particular topic because it is too broad and it will take some time, and I just wanted to focus on that and multiple facets of it. It pertains to this region, and you must have heard that in this month, earlier this month, the UK government released the Integrated Review of Security, Defense, Development and Foreign Policy. So it's a very comprehensive document which was issued by the UK Strategic Command, which is like the overall strategic planning framework for all the joint forces and development agencies and the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. So before we even go into it, I think it's very interesting that if you can see how I'll go delve into it a bit later, how France and Germany have their own sector specific policies on commerce and defense for the Indo-Pacific, but the UK is trying to look at this whole region from a wholly integrated perspective. And it's not just about the Indo-Pacific. The document is global by scope. It covers multiple regions, but obviously, just for the sake of relevance, I will only be discussing and commenting upon aspects which have some sort of interest or concern to Pakistan. So I'll begin with the fact that they've basically tried to summarize in the executive summary, they've tried to present four overarching objectives of issuing this policy document. And mind you, it has been signed by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So this is uh, in the period of Brexit, where the UK wants to be stand alone, independent of the EU, and try to assert itself as a global power. And the document mentions that 2021 is going to be the year of in which Britain is going to lead the world in terms of development, science and technology, etc. So they've categorically said that the UK wants to lead the world. Their focus, however, is not as much on defense or cyber or etc. The crux of it is that the UK has said that we want to lead the world in science and technology because the UK believes that science and technology is the capability upon which the UK can build its global soft power and its prestige and everything. So it's quite interesting that the UK, as compared to the US, has been able to boil down its essentials and the basis of its power projection into science and technology. And they've made it very clear that they don't want any sort of confrontation with anyone, and they want to have a collaborative approach. So the four overarching objectives are sustaining strategic advantage through science and technology. Obviously, that is the crux of their policy making. The second is that shaping the open international order of the future. So they're not saying that we want to make the order, or we want to impose the order, or we want to reinforce the order. They say we want to shape it. So obviously, shaping is basically a collaborative approach. And for more expert students of IR as yourself, you can see that multilateralism has a lot of role to play in that.
Hmm.
The
That's
third
really
point is strengthening security and defense at home and overseas. So this is an unusual talking point. And the fourth is building resilience at home and overseas. And frankly, I'm quite averse to the overuse of this term resilience. It just makes me sick now. But anyways, coming to the foreword by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and if some of the subscribers to this channel have been following, I published a video in the beginning of January 2021 in which I presented clips of some of the important geostrategic issues for Pakistan in 2021. And in one of them, I mentioned that the UK is deployment of aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth is going to be an important development in the region. And this is what Prime Minister Johnson says. He says that in 2021, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, one of the two largest warships, will lead a British and Allied task group on the UK's most ambitious global deployment for 2 decades. Mind you, this is 2 decades of deployment. Just imagine the sort of expenses and the logistics involved to sustain that power projection purpose, visiting the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. So I think, Tala, we have talked on in multiple previous episodes that ultimately you can see that the whole consolidation of Atlantic through Mediterranean with Indian Ocean and Pacific, the UK is basically headed in the same direction. So the US has not acknowledged that it is concerned about Mediterranean and Africa, but the UK has made it very clear that they want to start with the Mediterranean, and from the Atlantic side, they want to end up in the Pacific. So 2 decades of deployment, is it going to be a one go? Is it going to be rotational? Is it going to be in phases? That's still to be seen. And what they say is that by 2030, we, that is the UK, will be deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific as the European partner with the broadest, most integrated presence in support of mutually beneficial trade. We will be active in Africa, in particular East Africa, and with important partners such as Nigeria. So there you have it. That when we talk about Indo-Pacific, so in particular the sub-region which is going to have the most importance for them as far as trade is concerned, we're talking about the UK obviously, is East Africa. Now this is quite interesting because what the US's vision and Japan's vision and India's vision, whatever is, their focus is on the Bay of Bengal side, the Strait of Malacca and everything. But the UK has made it clear that its strategic planning is in terms of its trade and economic interests, and obviously, in that sense, it isn't illogical for the UK to focus on Africa. And indeed, the bulk of developmental assistance by the UK has been focused on Africa quite intensely over the past few years. And now this is next, and these are what I'm stating over here are the salients and my comments. So the next salient point which I picked up, I think you'll find this very interesting, and I want your thoughts on it. It says that the UK will shift away from post-Cold War rules-based international system to a fragmented order characterized by intense competition. I just want you to comment on it. So you see, basically they're saying that rules-based international order, isn't that the rhetoric which has been espoused by the US even today? That they talk about they want to bring China into the so-called rules-based international order, but here the UK is saying that we don't want to continue with that narrative anymore. We believe in adaptation and adjusting ourselves in this fragmented order characterized by quote unquote intense competition. That's quite interesting.
Absolutely. In fact, uh, that is a very that is a pragmatic way of dealing with world politics. And if you s- see the politics, I talked about the credibility of US as a leading power in the international system. So that credibility has been badly affected precisely because of the double speak. You are saying something, you are doing another thing. So, if the wording that has been used in this document, it shows pragmatism at the part of the United Kingdom. At least they are clear-eyed about how they want to engage with the world, and
Indeed.
they don't want to keep their their key allies in doubt about their intentions.
And it just goes to show you and that instead of trying to be unnecessarily coercive in nature and trying to intimidate countries in the region through policy documentation, they're actually being very clear, and they're saying, "Okay, look, we understand this is a fragmented world." The choice of the word fragmented is very interesting. It just goes to show you that that is actually a discrete acknowledgement that London considers the world not to be bipolar or unipolar. They they're openly accepting multipolarity in the world. And obviously, throughout the document, I'm not going to mention it. I think I'll mention one instance, but they've repeatedly stressed the importance of multilateralism, and that is the buzzword they have used throughout this document. And so, one of the next most important takeaways from this document is that security of the Euro-Atlantic region will be the bulk of the UK's security focus. So you might have a document, it might mention the Indo-Pacific, they might have an interest in the long term, midterm, whatever, but ultimately it jots down to, I think, one of the most important and honest admissions on behalf of a great power, that the UK is saying that despite our interest, our trade and economics, the Euro-Atlantic will remain our primary zone of interest. I
Achha,
have
point
not seen this sort of honest admission elsewhere.
indeed. But the thing is, I just realized, I just recalled, I don't know, I'm forgetting the name of the commentator, some person who writes on UK security posture. So
Shashank
he
Joshi.
and I don't know, perhaps I may have read Shashank Joshi, but someone wrote on Twitter, and I'm even forgetting the exact comment, but the crux was that this the crux was that too much inordinate. There is this. I'm trying to, for the lack of better phrasing of what is going on in my mind, but it was that to there it is an undue focus that that is being given to the Atlantic at this time, and it was like you could deploy. There was this they talked about that you can deploy. I think it was like you can deploy just one warship or XYZ, and all you won't there won't be any sort of you won't feel the need to the region security won't get compromised. So there was this urging at the part of on the part of the commentator that UK needs to shift its focus elsewhere, not on the Euro Atlantic, because that is not needed.
But that's ultimately because of competing interests. Ultimately, when you see that you know, you use the word pragmatic, it's so interesting. Pakistan, look, it says very clearly our primary area of focus is the North Arabian Sea. We are done, finished. They're not interested in the long term vision. So the UK ultimately, I think it's so pragmatic. They're saying, okay, fine, we have interests all over the world, Africa, Indian Ocean, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, for them, you see, because that's how this document is not going to be one of many. If they've issued this now, they're going to actually operationalize it among the joint services and the foreign common development office, etc., FCDO. So when they want to operationalize it, they want to make sure that their public and their expenses are focused on the area which matters most, and that is self defense to the immediate periphery, which is in the Euro Atlantic. But that raises the questions that why the Euro Atlantic? I mean, what is over there? Are there threats from West Africa? Because there is not that much of a terrorism specter in West Africa as compared to Central and East Africa. When we talk about, you know, the militant groups and other cartels going over there. But it just goes to show you that while the world is focused elsewhere and UK is obviously following them, they still want to be very assured and self-confident that Euro-Atlantic is going to be our primary focus area. But they also mention that, with moving on, they mentioned that when they talk about deeper engagement, quote unquote, with the Indo-Pacific so-called, they say that they recognize the importance of powers in the regions, quote unquote, such as China, India, and Japan, unquote. Very interesting. So they've not just mentioned Japan or India, they've mentioned China as well. So the UK recognizes that China, India, and Japan are three of the important powers in the region. And that sort of balancing approach in trying to acknowledge that China, whether you like it or not, is also a power and a stakeholder in the region. It is vastly different from the sort of language which you find in, so I, for example, policy documents by the US or the force posture statements by Indo-Pacific commander who says that China is a malign actor or it's a revisionist power or an assertive China or an increasingly bold China. So they've placed China and India and Japan, two quad powers and China in the same plate, and they're saying, look, they're all powers in the region. We recognize them, and they add that the UK would like, as far as multilateralism is concerned now. So this is interesting, and this is, I think, a common strain between French German visions for the Indo-Pacific and the UK. I'll go into more of that later. The UK says that it does not want to set up or get into the establishment of a multilateral organization. It's very clear that in the region they want to work with two bodies, namely ASEAN, which is already there, so that ASEAN centrality argument. And the next is very interestingly the CPTPP, and if you don't know, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just for the audience, the CPTPP is a trade agreement that was initiated in December 2018 between the following countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. The UK isn't even a part of it, but they want to be part of ASEAN and work together with CPTPP. So what they're saying is that these two consortiums, which are basically focused on Western Pacific and Eastern Indian Ocean, they want to work with them. And one very other interesting thing which I did not find is that they did not mention the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Now this is very interesting, Tala, because the German and French visions mention IORA, working with IORA. The UK has a very distinct approach, because I may be interpreting it wrongly, but as far as my perception is concerned, they are not that interested in a specific segment of the Indian Ocean. They want to take a collaborative and comprehensive approach. So now we come to the next point, and they say, and this, I think you'll find this point very interesting, the language. Quote, we must be prepared to compete with others and new ways to cooperate through creative diplomacy and multilateralism, unquote. So two words they've used: creative diplomacy, multilateralism. There is no mention of any coercion trying to impose the international order, or they're trying to assert that there's going to be a confrontation of any kind, even through any sort of dispute. They're very open. They say we must be prepared to compete with others. So that acknowledgement that there is a level playing field, and okay, fine, China is there, we want to compete. Even, I mean, that also sends a message to Russia as well. You want to come in the region, Mediterranean, Pacific, whatever, we are ready to compete. So they're in a competition mode. They are not in a confrontation mode. Very different from their other transatlantic partner. But they make this very important point as far as the Euro-Atlantic security is concerned, that NATO will remain the foundation of collective security in Euro-Atlantic. So while they're out of the EU for whatever reasons best considered to them, as far as collective security is concerned, they don't want to go it alone. They want to have a shared responsibility with other members of NATO, which obviously includes Turkey and the other European nations. So I think that's quite interesting that on that front, the UK is not going it alone. It just wanted to get out of the politics and the economics of European Union, but on the security front, perhaps because of lack of resources and a long-term vision, they know that they're not able to go it on their own, and they will have to rely on a NATO-centric approach to the region in the Euro-Atlantic. Now coming to the important part about China, what does the document about UK say? On China, it says, quote, we will do more to adapt. Please focus on the word adapt. We will do more to adapt to China's growing impact on many aspects of our lives as it becomes more powerful in the world. We will continue to pursue a positive trade and investment relationship with China while ensuring our national security and values are protected. Unquote. So you see over there, the UK is saying we would like to adapt to the Chinese rise, and they acknowledge and they actually project that China is going to continue being a powerful country in the region, perhaps beyond, and they want to pursue a positive trade and investment relationship. So whatever conflicts they might have with the political or strategic spectrum with China. They want to ensure that trade could be a way to break the ice on multiple occasions and lead to a positive outcomes in whatever confrontations they might have. And they go on to say the Indo-Pacific will be of increasing geopolitical and economic importance with multiple regional powers carrying significant weight and influence both alone and together. Obviously, this includes India. It doesn't mention, but I'm just assuming. Competition will play out there in regional militarization. This is very important. Now, you can take Western Indian Ocean into this. Competition will play out there in regional militarization, maritime tensions, and a contest over the rules and norms linked to trade and technology. And then they say, this is interesting because this directly mentions Pakistan. Quote, we have close historical links with Pakistan and will continue to develop a strong modern relationship focused on security, stability, and prosperity.
Hmm.
Unquote. So I think it's very interesting that as far as the other major powers are concerned, we've seen the Indo-Pacific visions and documents of US, France, Germany, even there are some other countries, Japan, and we've seen Korea and Australia. But UK is the only country which has given special attention and an increased focus to India, but it has also specifically and distinctly mentioned its association to Pakistan, which I think is quite interesting because Pakistan has since long been trying to, if not seek equivalence, but it is trying to say that we want to be acknowledged as a separate entity in this part of the world. We don't want to be hyphenated or subsumed under the India bracket or the Afghan bracket. So the fact that they've mentioned a distinct layout of their plan for with Pakistan, that's to their credit and it's good for us. And they say this is important because I didn't know this before. I've read it in the document and then I looked it up. It's true. So the UK has actually appointed a Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office (FCDO) Director General for the Indo-Pacific in 2020. I didn't know this, but apparently they have, who concurrently serves as an ambassador to ASEAN in 2019. So there are two hats he's wearing. The ambassador to ASEAN is also responsible for development and politics of the UK in the Indo-Pacific region. Now that's a huge area of responsibility when you're talking about one man holding all the reins. And they've mentioned that since 2018, the UK has appointed trade commissioners in Singapore, Mumbai, and Shanghai. So as far as trade is concerned, you can see that the UK has not appointed any significant sort of an attaché in Pakistan apart from the usual economic counselors, etc. But in the larger scheme of things, they are focused on India and the East. Their focus is not as much on the Western side. I mean, even beyond Pakistan in the Gulf, or because obviously in the Indo-Pacific concept, the Gulf is also a part of the Indo-Pacific. East Africa is also a part, but they're focused more on the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, which is, I think, quite interesting. And with that, I conclude the UK portion, and now I'd just like to shed light on some important snippets of two other countries, their Indo-Pacific visions. And the reason I'm mentioning them is that you can just have an idea of how they compare to the UK. I deliberately chose two countries from Europe to have that semblance and the fair semblance, and did not mention the US because we've studied the US many times. France and Germany, because they are these two Euro Atlantic powers which have a history of colonialism and strategic importance in the region. And so I begin with Germany's document, which was issued in September 2020. It is called Light Linear Zoom Indo-Pacific, which is the policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific. And there are three important takeaways as far as I am concerned. The first one is that the German federal government supports inclusive regional cooperation initiatives. And the important thing they've mentioned is, quote, it does not consider containment and decoupling strategies to be conducive, unquote. Very interesting. So they've mentioned that that policy of containment, don't bring us into it. We are beyond that. So that is the sort of similarity which I noticed in the UK, in which it is trying to keep itself away from such controversial terminologies. And it says the ASEAN centric security architecture offers a valuable framework. Now, the difference is obviously that Germany has limited itself to ASEAN while the UK is going to CPTPP as well.
Hmm.
Next, the German document says that we want to seek observer status at the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Plus and become a dialogue partner of Pacific Islands Forum, expand cooperation with IORA in business and maritime safety. So, apart from the usual focus on the Pacific element, as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, they want to focus on cooperation with, they want to become an extended partner of IORA. This is not in the UK policy. So that cooperation with IORA is interesting and just goes to show you that there are some European countries which want to have their say in this part of the world as far as maritime safety and cooperation is concerned. And they also mentioned that they want to promote quote unquote intensive exchange with BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal initiative, which you are well aware with about technical cooperation and uh, other ventures. So that cooperation with BIMSTEC, now BIMSTEC, as we all know, is a Bangladesh and India powered venture in the Bay of Bengal. And from what I have been able to gather, if we keep this German vision into perspective, Germany's interest is as much in Western Indian Ocean as it is on the Eastern Indian Ocean side. So while they want to expand cooperation with IORA and BIMSTEC, the Germans also mentioned that we want to support SARC, but they acknowledge that SARC is not the sort of once powerful forum that is once was. And it's interesting, this mention of SARC, it just goes to show you that the Germans still believe that there is an opportunity for a South Asia led regional order to put its house in order and try to maintain some semblance of political stability in the region. And by support, obviously, they mean that they might be open to any sort of rapprochement between Islamabad and Delhi.
Hmm.
So, and finally, I'm coming to the document of France, which issued its defense strategy for the Indo-Pacific in 2019. So this
Hmm.
came a year before Germany, and its salient points include uh, all of these are extracts. The enduring conflict between India and Pakistan now extends into the naval domain. Now this is interesting. Quote, in the meantime, the current rapprochement between Islamabad and Beijing makes the regional security equation more complex, unquote. So the French are basically saying, okay, we understand that there is an ongoing issue between India and Pakistan and they have this volatile relationship, but that relationship between Islamabad and Beijing, that makes things more complex. My question is that when you put Islamabad, you bring China into that whole equation, why don't you mention about the complexities caused by India's interference in the neighborhood? And obviously, this is a sarcastic question because we all know that France has a deep rooted strategic ties with India based primarily on the agreement involving Rafales and other such things. They're selling their armament over there. And India, if you check the document which I've just quoted, they have appendices of maps, infographics in that document, and they've mentioned very clearly that India is the only country in the entire Indian Ocean where France has an armaments officer apart from a typical military attache. So that is a sort of special, significant relationship which they have with India. And the next point is, quote, be it in the Indian Ocean, in Asia, or in the Pacific, the fragility of regional security architectures feeds uncertainty. In a region fraught with heterogeneous political systems and ambitions, such dynamics contribute to the erosion of multilateralism. Unquote. So, what they're saying is they believe that regional security architectures are feeding uncertainty. I have to ask you this. What do you think they could be implying toward? What sort of regional security are they talking about? SARC, perhaps?
Um, I don't know. Perhaps I would have to think about it.
But I mean, they use the word feeds uncertainty. I mean, they say that the regional countries are unable to maintain that sort of assertive approach toward conflict resolution in the region, and that is why France has to pay attention to this. That's quite arrogant. and they believe that because of this supposed matter, multilateralism is being eroded, which is quite strange because in the UK document they say that they want to cooperate with existing architectures, etc., etc., and that they just want to play a facilitative role. So France has a totally very myopic view of the entire Indian Ocean region.
So the heterogeneity is being unwelcomed by France.
Absolutely.
It's a very strange thing. In fact, heterogeneity being being a part of the supposed being a part of the West, where supposedly you talk about enlightenment and free values and all. France is rubbishing heterogeneity, and France believes that the heterogeneity is it's and again now I think I would want to comment on what you said earlier. I was thinking about it. They think that heterogeneity is not conducive to multilateral spirit.
Yes, they say it is responsible for eroding multilateralism.
Yes, you're right. The choice of wording is very arrogant.
And so coming to the next point, they say that strategic rivalries in the Indian Ocean could be exported to Africa. So you see, I think this is the only European country which is straight away coming to the point
Uh,
that Africa is going to suffer, and we all know the Francophonie and all the history of France's colonies in Africa, and we still know that France has tremendous energy and security interests in the African continent. They've always considered it as part of their backyard, and they still support some of the insurrectionist groups over there. So you just wonder that ultimately their concern, which is natural, you see, why is everybody so interested in the Western Indian Ocean? Obviously, because of Africa. So here France is saying that we are concerned that strategic rivalries from the ocean could be exported to Africa. Quote, in a sense, distant actors like European countries are not immune to the potential effect of any crisis happening in the region, unquote. So basically, that Eurocentric approach, they're saying that we as Europe have dangers, that our backyard in Africa is going to be destabilized because of these actors or destabilizing factors in the Indian Ocean, which could spill over into the continent. So ultimately, that it is that Eurocentric approach to things. So it's not that they're trying to focus on their own interests beyond their area of concern. They've actually tried to link it to their own domestic security interests. This obviously implies the issue of migration, of increased radicalization and terrorism, etc. And so they're concerned that you see, it's interesting how the Indian Ocean has been intertwined with France's uh, primary security periphery in the European continent. So, where is the Indian Ocean and where is Europe? But here they are saying that Africa could serve as a conduit to bring the conflict from that part of the world to our shores. Very interesting, but it personally doesn't make sense. And
uh,
now coming to an
so
important point. Yes, yes,
yes.
Tala.
No, that begs the questions. That why is France then if they are linking the destabilization the destabilization that could permeate all the way from Asia to Africa. to the and you they are using it as a reason to link themselves with the Indo-Pacific with the larger Indo-Pacific region. It's a very strange way of justifying that justifying yourself as a relevant actor in the Indo-Pacific. It's a very strange way. It is like they are somehow they are like they are contorting themselves just to justify the relevance in being a part of being a in keeping them making themselves relevant here.
Relevant. I mean, just look in the UK document, they made it very clear that look, we have trade interests in Africa and East Africa, etc. So we have our concerns over there. And interestingly, France could have mentioned that they have islands in East Africa, the France Réunion Island. They could have mentioned that,
Yes,
but they're citing
yes,
threats from
they
Indian
could have
Ocean.
mentioned that. Absolutely, I was coming to that point. They could have mentioned that, but they are now linking it that the destability will spill over to Africa, and Africa is in our periphery, and it concerns us. So that this is just a strange way of putting things, um, making yourself feel more welcome in the region.
And so the next point is very interesting, and this is the highlight of the as far as China is concerned. They say, "quote China is, with the implementation of its Belt and Road Initiative, one of the driving forces behind contraction of the geostrategic space, and China will probably increase its military footprint in Indian Ocean in the medium term." Unquote. So how is just China responsible for contraction in the geostrategic space? I fail to understand that how is that linked to, I mean, again, why are they focusing on China's so-called aggressive role in the Western Indian Ocean? Aren't they concerned about some other countries as well? I mean, obviously, China is not just sitting over there and it just triggers or initiates something to provoke everyone else. China is also is responding to some of the developments happening in its own place. And if a country like India decides to hold naval exercises in the Sea of Japan for no logical reason whatsoever, and China decides to do the same because it has a logistics facility in Djibouti, and interestingly, as we are talking of Djibouti,
US
um,
also has a facility in Djibouti.
yes, and
US,
France is there, but
France is there, Japan is there. Everyone
but
is in
here's the
Djibouti.
interesting thing. Here's a point which I think they have tried to send out a signal to China. The document says, talking about Djibouti, quote, by being able to carry operations from its overseas territories as well as its forward bases in Djibouti and Abu Dhabi, which is the UAE, France will remain a partner committed to security and stability of the areas in which it has interests. French forces in Djibouti and UAE are vital to full implementation of our defense cooperation and to our action for regional security. Unquote. Now, Tala, you know that there is a trilateral drill being underway in hosted by UAE. It has India and France as well. It is taking place right now. It is a 2 week exercise. Indian Air Force is participating with Sukhois over there. I think you mentioned this in a previous episode. And you see that France, and this is a very interesting aspect. You see, they've sent a message to China. This is my personal interpretation, and I strongly stand by it. France is one of the few European countries which has a proper deployment and detachment in the UAE, apart from the US, of course. It's too obvious to mention the US in every instance. So I'm talking about France now. They have a base in Djibouti. They have facilities in their islands. They have regional command controlling the southern Indian Ocean. And they mentioned that UAE and Djibouti would serve as our counterforce options if there is any threat to us in the region. Now, this is obviously the Western Indian Ocean. They do not mention about any other such facilities on the other side of the Bay of Bengal or the Western Pacific. So here the question which I want to ask is, what is up with this Indo-Pacific nomenclature? Why doesn't France just say strategy for the Indian Ocean? Where is the Pacific in all of this? I mean, the only brief mention which they did is they say that um, By 2030, the ability of both China and India to deploy carrier battle groups in Indian Ocean and Pacific will particularly set a completely new operational environment. But that's just the basic mention, a concern about a battle group in the Pacific by China. But again, they're focused only on the western side of the Indian Ocean because Africa. And coming to the next point, now this is very important, and I think this doesn't make sense to me. So I want you to help me understand what this point has any relevance to the Indo-Pacific. Quote: France faces the strategic challenge of military nuclear multipolarity with a center of gravity located in the Indo-Pacific. First question, Talha, what is military nuclear multipolarity? And they say the center of gravity is the Indo-Pacific. And do you know what they say? Let me proceed and tell you which countries they have named in particular. I quote: the significant development of Pakistani nuclear arsenal presents a second major challenge after North Korea. This is what they have said.
Okay.
There is no mention of India. They have not, I mean, just to be fair, they haven't even mentioned Chinese ICBMs or whatever. The only thing they mention, as far as first they present this horrifying picture, military nuclear multipolarity, center of gravity in Indo-Pacific. And then the instance they quote is this one instance: the Pakistani strategic nuclear arsenal is a matter of concern, and they say that presents a second major challenge after North Korea. So basically, they're saying that North Korea is the primary threat, and then Pakistan. I mean, not even China. This is just surprising. And they don't mention India's development of the Agni intercontinental ballistic missiles or other missiles which can reach France also. How what should I say, how hypocritical can you be, or how elusive can you be to intentionally ignore the strategic arsenal being developed by India?
It is a convenient talking point. I think the analysts who are sitting in the West, were you were justifying their politics in Asia. They are I don't know, they are very lazy. I think uh, they haven't updated the fact sheets that have been. I think this is a very convenient talking point going on since the last 15, 20 years. Okay, Pakistani nuclear arsenal falling in the hands of terrorists. What utter bullshit. So very hypocritical. Very hypocritical.
And so here are the final 2 points, and these are specifically related to France's impeccable relationship with India as a regional partner, so called. And the first point is that in order to contribute jointly to Indian Ocean security, France will develop bilateral cooperation with India at both strategic and operational levels. So obviously that means that beyond some sort of agreements, etc., there is going to be operational. Obviously means there's going to be enhanced exchange of military exercises and maneuvers, which could be used in a contingency situation. And now the concluding point which I have selected and which will wrap up my session. I think this is the gist, and this also mentions IORA. I quote: in the Indian Ocean, France will work together with its major partners bracket India and Australia and with the EU countries towards strengthening of Indian Ocean Naval Symposium that it will chair for 2 years from 2020. So as we all know, IONS was and is a project initiated by Indian Navy for naval diplomacy in the region. Pakistan used to be a part, but after the Mumbai attacks, etc., Pakistan was invited once briefly, and then it has been excluded from it. So France is giving particular attention to that Indian Navy-led project. Now, IORA is still a bit neutral because IORA was launched in Mauritius, and there was these other countries involved. It's a multilateral platform. IONS is an Indian Navy-led platform, so that sort of importance you are giving to the Indian Navy as a so-called net security provider in the region is very interesting. And they say, and France, why France says that they're trying to legitimize it by saying that France is going to be the chair of IONS for 2 years, beginning from 2021 onward. So That's the reason why you can see a lot of French naval officials have been and Air Force officials have been visiting India. There have been exchanges going on. That collaboration over there talks about France focusing not specifically in IORA, which would have still presented some sort of a justifiable picture. But they're saying Germany hasn't mentioned IONS, the UK hasn't mentioned IONS. France is saying we want to prop up Indian Navy led architecture as our support system. And it says we will contribute to the strengthening of Indian Ocean Commission. And finally, they say it will reiterate by it, I'm talking to the joint partnership between France, India, Australia, and EU countries to become a member of Indian Ocean Rim Association, of which it is currently a dialogue partner. So yes, it is true that France is still just a dialogue partner. Now France wants to become a member. Interesting question, quick question. I don't understand that. You see, Germany is talking about IORA, France is talking about IORA, and I don't see any sort of because in IORA the rule is if one country, any one country vetoes the membership of another, then it cannot join. So the only reason Pakistan has not been able to join is that India is the sole country vetoing its membership. France and Germany, France and Germany are very easy. They're going to be members, and I don't expect any opposition going on, at least for now, at least. And ultimately, the apocalypse would be that Israel would one day join the IORA, and Pakistan would be still sitting and saying, well, I think it's about time that we also come into the IORA. So, we don't need to give a hoot to IONS. We don't need to give a hoot to Pacific Islands Forum or whatever, or those other bodies, or even from a very limited, short-sighted perspective. But now we have to understand. You see, these two major European powers, if you exclude them from this conversation, so in the big picture, we see that the UK, comparatively, Talha, it has a very mature, collaborative, pragmatic, and I think it's going to be a very working and functional relationship with countries, and it makes for a very comfortable reading, at least for analysts sitting in Pakistan. What would you say on that, now that I've covered up the entire the policy discourse? I think the UK has made quite a wonderful attempt to explain its vision very properly.
I cannot make any substantive contribution to this, but I think the difference between the approaches of Germany, France, and Germany, France on one end of the spectrum, and UK on the other end of the spectrum, is that perhaps as a colonial power, UK had because of because the understanding of the sensibilities, the nuances of the region, being a colonial power in this area of the world, UK has a much better understanding of the heterogeneous politics. I think that is why they have been very responsible in their utterance
Indeed.
vis-a-vis. This is my opinion. I cannot make anything. I cannot contribute anything more
I think I'm
substantive.
just. I think it would be rightful to say that because Pakistan has been fortunately or unfortunately part of the Commonwealth, so that the little leeway which we've been able to get in the UK's vision is because of that
Yes,
Commonwealth
yes.
binding factor.
Commonwealth. Commonwealth is one important factor. Not only colonial
So
understanding, but also Commonwealth.
exactly. So basically, this wraps up my segment, and as you can see, that in my personal understanding and final conclusion, I believe that what is written and what is done obviously are two wholly different things. But as far as the written word is concerned, the UK seems to have a very nuanced and balanced take on a collaborative approach and adaptable approach to the region. And at least for Pakistan, it should be a breath of relief, but we have yet to see how Pakistan is able to highlight itself prominently and distinctly from India. And I think the onus of that will lie on Pakistan because, as far as the US is concerned, we can't expect the US to stop supporting India as a regional watchdog. And in the recent Islamabad dialogue, Ambassador retired Cameron Munter, he made it clear that the US practically doesn't give a hoot about Pakistan in its general discourse anymore. He made it very clear. So I think the UK has traditionally enjoyed exceptional military relations with Pakistan. We have an opportunity here to try to take a proactive approach and build on that relation, though that shared historical military strategic relation, and try to secure sizable space for us, distinct from India, because obviously India has its own charm offensive when it comes to the West. But if we fail to do that, then obviously expecting anything interesting or receptive from France and Germany would, I think, be beyond Pakistan's experience, because these two countries we haven't really been able to take advantage of them properly for our own interests is concerned.
Okay, so the last segment of the session, we'll briefly touch upon it because I'm sure the viewers have an idea about, have a fairly good idea about what has transpired. The meeting, the high-level meeting that has happened between Blinken, Sullivan, Wang Yi, and Yang Jiechi. So I was interested in how it has been framed. The meeting was, this high level meeting was framed. So before these talks happened, ahead of the talks, you have Chao Lijian, who served in Pakistan as well. Now,
Our old friend.
yes. So he said that the Chinese diplomats were invited, quote unquote, were invited by the US for a high level strategic dialogue, which seeks to bring the China US relationship back to the right track of sound and steady development. And and I would continue from here. When the meeting concluded, State Councillor Yang Jiechi, the meeting concluded yesterday. So he talked about how the strategic exchange, I am focusing on the word strategic exchange, was frank, constructive, and helpful. But if you see how China is framing the dialogue and how Washington is framing the dialogue on the other end, it's very different. In front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee meeting that happened last week, Blinken rejected the notion that this is a strategic dialogue. He said this is not a strategic dialogue, and there is no intent at this point for a series of follow-on engagement. So it's very interesting. You see China continuing to push for what it considers a new type of great power relationship. And the idea of strategic dialogue fits the notion that the US and China are leading powers that should make important decisions together about the world. But the US isn't buying it. So this is one interesting thing that you see, the divergence between both. And one more observation that I would like to add. It's quite surprising too that there was no joint statement after
Indeed.
after a
Very
heated
astute observation.
It doesn't mean that the US and China have no areas of mutual convergence. There are certain areas of mutual convergence. You have the issue of North Korea, in the nuclear arsenal of North Korea. That is one issue. You have the issue of climate change. These are areas of convergence where you could have, both the parties could have talked on, but no conversation was made. If some conversation would have been made, that there would definitely have been some sort of joint statement issued at the end. but no joint statement was issued between both the parties. That was not right. I think and I wrote this on Twitter as well, that the conversation that happened between both the parties, the video that came out of this initial exchange between these four high officials, it was quite unsettling for us who are especially living in this part of the world. It was quite unsettling.
And they
Uh,
very specifically mentioned, I think the most prominent accusation was that they accused the US, the hosts, of foregoing diplomatic niceties and protocols. That was a huge allegation.
Absolutely. You see, I want to keep it short, but when the US, when this delegation from China was invited to come and sit down, at the same time, you see on the eve of the talks, you see that US uh, uh, issued a flurry of actions directed to China. They begin revoking Chinese telecom licenses. They subpoena to multiple Chinese information technology companies over national security concerns, and they even updated sanctions on China on Hong Kong issue. So
Indeed.
this was that was why um Yang questioned United States over these sanctions, and he said, "Well, I think we thought, quote unquote, well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought that the U.S. Side would follow the necessary diplomatic protocols." So it was a great apparent for the Chinese delegation what happened, and the Chinese also followed through. You see uh, how China has indicated that it will begin trial just recently, just on when this as a reaction to this, that they would begin trial on two Canadians that were detained on spying charges, and this tit for tat is going on. Um,
I saw a lot of banners by Chinese diplomats. They use the same imagery being shared by MFA. I think it was issued to them from back channel. It was this poster which had the picture of the four leaders sitting, two on each side, and it said, "Stop interfering in internal affairs of China and stop trying to. The US does not have the moral right or the prestige to try to tell us what to do." I mean,
okay.
I think the problem I think is that you have been following Wang Yi's travels to the world a lot, and you particularly have been focusing on Blinken for a while. You see, if these four leaders, they're very, very mature people and they're very astute people in their own regard. If they got caught in this imbroglio, I think that there was some sort of a miscommunication or misguidance between the mid-level diplomats on both ends of their countries. They are to blame for this lapse which resulted in that fiasco which took place.
I don't know. There is one thing. There is one more important thing. Uh, this you see the excerpt, that the transcript that was issued. See the video of Jake Sullivan. So he has somehow he has been trying to accuse when Young concluded, or perhaps it was Wang, but he tried to make it sound like the Chinese delegation was indulging in theatrics.
Yes,
Just
indeed, indeed, you're right.
just just to arouse the domestic sentiments back home. But um, even though this word was used, long lectures, long widening statements, quote unquote, long widening statements, lecture, these wordings were directed at the Chinese side. But if you read what has been written in the New York Times, there is an official that was a part of this, a US official who was a part of this,
Entourage.
was a part of this entourage. Um, he has explicitly commented that we do not perceive China's sharp tone as rhetorical or grandstanding for domestic audience. So
Hmm.
they also get this impression, even though Jake Sullivan's statement would be something would suggest otherwise. Perhaps in the moment he thought that this was theatrics, but when they went back to the drawing board, they realized that this was a serious thing that was happening. This was no grandstanding, or this wasn't a rhetorical statement from the Chinese. These were not the rhetorical statements from the Chinese delegation. So I don't know. I hope.
Perhaps it
Uh,
is because it is a new administration and they have taken time to, be briefed about what has been going on during the Trump era. Because Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, obviously, they've been here for many years now. So obviously, they're experienced diplomats, and maybe Sullivan and Blinken, especially, it had been a long time. It was lastly in the Obama era when he was familiar with background working. So maybe he wasn't really sure about the posturing which China was trying to make, and they conceived their statements as some sort of so quote unquote theatrics. But indeed, it was very unusual. And you don't see. I mean, keeping everyone aside, I think Wang Yi of all people, I think he is one of the finest diplomats I've seen conduct himself across the globe. And to see a person like that getting into a heated debate, that really shows you that something really bad was going on.
even Yang is very well respected. If you go through his past diplomatic record, he's the most senior most diplomat. And if you go through his past statements, he has perhaps he has also accompanied George George Bush on some high profile delegations to China. He has been a part of those delegations. So these are very senior diplomats. How they are reacting, it's quite unusual. And again, I don't want to extend it, but even there was this professor. I don't know, perhaps Henry Gao or some other Chinese academician who said that even you talked about some mess up that happened. He said that when Yang talked about how we don't US cannot consider that it is engaging us from a position of strength.
Exactly. Very important point. Very important point.
So he said that he said perhaps it was communicated to him that somehow it got mixed up. It was like position of strength is not a it's it position of if someone says that it is position of power, so then this rebuke from this strong retort from the Chinese side would have been justified. But when you say that you are engaging with someone from a position of strength, there is this interplay of words. This some screw up happened at the very top level.
So,
So
just a quick question on this. It might sound unrelated. Very quickly, do you think that maybe after observing all this, that President Vladimir Putin, now already we know he had a talk with Biden and he called him a killer. He literally called him a killer. He called
yes,
Putin a killer. So you see, China and Russia are the major powers in this region on our side, basically. So, how do you think that terrible optics with Russia and now China, how do you think that will impact the perception in the region? Very quick take on that.
very quick take on that. Okay. Um, I'm trying to recall. You said you talked about how Biden called Putin a killer, and Putin said it takes one to no one.
Exactly. And now this whole fiasco, well, it was not Biden, but his top representatives with the Chinese. So you have two uh, strategic adversaries of the US, and
And
you have
I'm trying. Sorry for interjecting. I'm trying to recall one more thing. Biden has used some, it's quite unlike Biden. You could have expected this from Trump, but in a similar manner, he has uh, uh, he has talked about Kim Jong Un as well. Like he called Putin a killer. He labeled he indulged in some labeling. Uh, against Kim Jong Un as well. I'm forgetting the label. What was
He's barely been 3 months in office, this administration in Washington, and you see that they've really effed up their optics as far as engaging two strategic adversaries is concerned. That really sends very wrong signals. That actually erodes the sort of confidence which people had that Biden would depart from the Trump era confrontation with China, and obviously he had some his own dealings with Russia. But this was this Alaska, the fiasco in Anchorage.
exactly.
Exactly.
Uh,
So,
yes,
are you
he
looking something up?
when he was vice president under Barack Obama, he in fact yes, absolutely, he called Kim a thug when he was hearing.
Okay.
He called Putin a killer. He called Kim a thug. So the adversaries that you are dealing with, the other countries that you are dealing with, you solidify certain perceptions in uh, on their end, and then they follow through. So this is not a constructive way of doing politics.
Indeed. And with that, thank you, Tala, for your time. And it's we'd like to wrap up this long but very engaging and captivating episode of the Scheme of Things. I think it would be safe to summarize that our attention was limited
Hmm.
to the so-called Indo-Pacific in this entire episode. Until next time, from Talha and myself, Assalamu alaikum.
Goodbye.